All right, good morning.
Good morning.
We're getting started a bit late this morning because of a variety of things, not the least of which was that I didn't get here as early as I hoped to, so I hope you'll bear with me as we kind of move through some of this early part, maybe not quickly exactly, but without necessarily too much delay anyway. So we finished talking about Indiana Jones and looking at some of the different ideas that you can that come out of that movie, the Last Crusade, that can be beneficial from the standpoint of starting conversations about the Bible, about spiritual matters, and we also looked at some of the pitfalls in some of the assumptions or some of the ways that the world, including the people who made that movie, look at faith, and they look at the Bible and the limitations of their knowledge or understanding of some of those things. And so we're going to move on to a new subject. And so today, before we get started with the actual movie clips, I want us to take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is one of the passages that most talks about this idea of how we put ourselves in a mental place of outreach to other people by meeting them where they are. Not in the sense of getting involved in all the bad things that they're doing, that's not the solution, but in the sense of going where they are and understanding what they're thinking about and what they're concerned about, and not changing the message, but directing the message at those things, as opposed to just trying to sort of do a cookie cutter thing of, one size fits all. I've got the gospel, come get it from me or you're going to hell. Because we've learned at this point that simply is not a workable message with most of the people of our modern generation anyway. So, I'd like somebody to read for me verses 19 through 23.
For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some. And I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I might become a fellow partaker of it.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. I think it's really interesting that I'm going to jump to the end, because that's, of course, the best place to start reviewing a reading we just did. But I think it's really interesting that what Paul says there at the end is, he says, I do all things for the sake of the gospel. So Paul's focus with his life, and we see this borne out in all of the things we see in Acts and all the books he wrote, we see that his purpose in life is the service of, the expansion of, the spread of the gospel. That's what he is focused on. And it's interesting because at the end here he says, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Isn't Paul already a partaker of the gospel? Didn't he already receive grace? I mean, he talks about that enough in Romans, clearly he did. What does he mean when he says that I may become a partaker of it? Jerry.
In several places, in several of the letters that Paul writes, he alludes to the fact that the people that he's writing to are part of them, and he is part of them. And I think that's the idea that he's talking about here. We have a common faith, and he wants to be part of your faith. He's going to teach you, and you will be brothers in Christ.
Interesting. I like that idea. So that's the idea there. Let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. The idea there would be that he wants them to become his fellow partakers, and that he wants to become united with them through the gospel in a way that right now he's not with those who are not in the gospel. He doesn't have that brotherhood, he doesn't have that relationship that he does with those who are in the gospel. That's an interesting, I hadn't thought about that. That's a really interesting perspective on that. Anybody else have a different view? I'm not looking for a specific answer here. I'm curious to see what you guys think, because there's several places where Paul says things like this, and I think I have a sense of what he might mean, but I don't want to necessarily jump all over it until I give you guys a chance to give me what you think.
So the last part in my version is that I might share with them in its blessings. So very similar to what Jerry was
Okay.
saying, is that it's not just something to hoard.
Okay, so this is that idea that the gospel is not something that belongs to me. The gospel is something that has been entrusted to me to share with others. And I think that perspective is a really important perspective when we think about evangelism, when we think about personal relationships and how that leads to evangelism, is that we don't hoard, that is a really good word, hoard the gospel. It's not something that we, you get that, we have this idea of guarding the faith, and that's totally true in one sense. We don't want to lose our faith or have our faith undermined or taken away, but we don't guard the faith the way that you guard like a castle where nobody can get in, and you're going to pour boiling pitch down on them if they get too close to the gospel or something like that. We want to share the gospel, we want to guard the truth of it, but not for the purposes of keeping it away from other people. It's for the purposes of expanding the gospel and sharing the gospel. So the idea then of being fellow partakers would be that we are all sharing together in this. The other concept you see sometimes from Paul is this idea that if people that he's preached to don't listen, he feels like he's kind of almost wasted some effort. Like he uses the phrase run in vain, not in the sense that actually initially at least he was concerned that what he was preaching was not quite right, and then he met with the apostles in Jerusalem and figured out it was. But there are several times where he talks about that he doesn't want his work to be in vain with a particular church, particularly the Corinthians, because, the Corinthians. So there's a number of different places, though, where he kind of is saying, look, I'm putting in all this work, I don't want it to go to waste, because people don't listen, or because people miss the point, or because people fall away. And so I'm very fervent about bringing as many people in as I can, and keeping them on the right track once they're in. And so he has this paternal sense, and I don't mean that in the negative way that sometimes gets used today. He has this paternal sense of a relationship to the churches that he helped to found and to the Christians that he helped to convert, that he's very much concerned about their spiritual welfare, and that they're making progress and that they're going the right way. And so when he follows up with them with these letters that he writes, he has a very, there is kind of a fathers coming to visit kind of a vibe a lot of times to them. If you read Corinthians, read Thessalonians in particular, of course Timothy and Titus, but in some ways he was spiritually their father in a very much more fundamental way. So you see this kind of idea coming out that he is concerned about them like a father for children almost. And so he doesn't want to lose out in the sense of losing some of the ones that he had brought in as well. So, okay, so let's go back to the beginning now, though, because I want to talk about that because I think it lays the foundation for understanding what Paul's writing here. So Paul says, I make myself a slave to everyone. What does he mean by that? What ways does he make himself a slave to everyone?
Teaching.
Teaching, okay.
Trying to convert.
I mean, sometimes I feel like teaching is like slavery when you're working with some of those kids, but so these are the things he does. But how does that equate to slavery in his mind?
My version is servant.
Okay, the two. That's one of those terms that's kind of indistinguishable at the time because there weren't very many like voluntary servants in the purest sense. So either way, the notion is I make myself someone who has to do this because that is what I am required to do. That's probably, we're going to use a few more words. That's probably the best way to say it. But he's conveying the idea that what he's doing is he is somehow lowering himself so that other people's priorities, other people's needs and wants are ahead of his. And first and foremost, of course, is whose priority? Christ. The priority of Christ in spreading the gospel. But under that and ahead of himself is everyone else that he's spreading the gospel to. So how does he carry out this slavery then? How does that look in practice according to what he says here?
Christ himself, with the apostles, made very similar comments that you're going to have to be a servant rather than the one in charge. And that I think is Paul's attitude here, is that he recognizes the need that he has to serve and to fulfill that legacy that he has, that God gave him to do.
Yeah.
And that he is making that do whatever it takes to bring a soul to Christ, whatever it takes.
Okay, so first, and to that point, I think all the apostles, I think, had a sense of that too. When we see the various sacrifices that they made, this sense of they didn't see it at the time when Jesus is talking to them about, that whoever wants to be first has to be last, and whoever wants to lead has to be the servant of all. At the time, they didn't get it, but later on, they did, and I think they began to grasp it, and they began to live it. And so we see them living out this idea, and we see Paul as he says himself, the one who's like unnaturally born. He's late to the party, basically, but he still feels like he has an obligation to do that as well. Mark?
I was going to say, him especially would go to the synagogues, and he would go where the Jews were and try to show them about Christ. So in other words, he didn't have to do that, because now he understood that he's not under the law anymore. But he went there, and he just went, and he went to other people, the people without the law, the people who were Gentiles, where they gathered. Mm-hmm. And he went to the Acropolis, and he went to places where he knew people would listen to him, at least to start. So he went to where the people were. Okay. And sometimes he had to lower himself because he knew they didn't know the truth. Yeah. And he had to show them that. And I think that's part of what he was saying. I had to go and do things that I really didn't want to do, but I did it anyway because I wanted to reach these people. Yeah.
So for a guy who knows he's not under the law anymore, going into the synagogue and putting up with the Jews might not be too much fun. For a guy who was raised as a Jew, going to the Acropolis where all this idolatry is going on would not have been that much fun. So you can see where in all of those situations there's this maybe sense of, this is not what I would want to be doing if I had the choice. Steve?
I was going to say this whole section really deals with our freedom and liberty in Christ and not using that to the detriment of the cause of Christ. And that's where Paul is trying to express. I could brag about the fact that I'm an apostle, that I've met Jesus, I'm a pretty marvelous person, that kind of a deal, but he doesn't do that. He says, I make myself subservient for the cause of Christ.
Yeah.
But it never gives him license to sin for the cause of Christ.
Right. And we're going to get to that. So let's hold that thought for a second, because I want to kind of wrap this one up first and come back to that. So hold that thought for me for a second. Jerry, and then I'm going to go Sarah.
Just when you look at the word slave and the way it was used at that time, the slave had a master, and he had to do what that master told him to do, even if he didn't want to do it, even if he didn't like to do it, even if he thought it was wrong. The slave had to do what the master said. And in that sense, I think Paul has the same kind of an attitude. Yes. God is his master. I am going to do what he has told me to do, no matter what. Yes.
And Jesus actually said to him, said to Ananias when he sent him to Paul when he was blind, I'm going to show him how much he must suffer for the gospel and for me, basically. So, Sarah.
I think whenever I read this, if I change out servant to be more relatable, I was relatable to the Jews, I was relatable to those inside the law and to the Acropolis. Not that he participated, but knowing that he had a higher understanding, a more global aspect of things. Our kids come to us with stuff and I'm like, that's so not what I need to be focusing on right now. But if I push them aside, then they're not validated. They're unloved. They have that feeling that turns worse, and they can't understand that I had something else in my brain, or their question was so far down on the list of priorities. So you sit there and you have to listen to the atrocious art explanation and be like, that's so beautiful, and then it gives them validation and encourage and feels love to go further and do stuff, and it becomes more relatable to build them up as a human so that you can get to the next step. And so I agree, it's not participating in the sin, it's not even condoning the sin that was happening. It is more finding a common topic or something that's relatable to then bring them along further.
Okay, so it's this idea of becoming relatable to people, finding common ground. So when he goes through and he lists the different things, to the Jews I became as a Jew, not a real stretch for him considering his background. To those who are under the law, as under the law, again, not a real big stretch for him considering his background. What does it really mean by under the law? What is he saying? How do you have altered his behavior to be acceptable to the Jews or to those under the law?
But Mark said he goes to the synagogue
Okay.
and tries to teach there, following the rules of the synagogue at the time.
But I think it goes beyond that. It's depending on the circumstance, he would eat and follow the customs of the Jews. He at one point later in his career, probably later than he wrote this book, engaged in some kind of a Jewish vow in order to go back to Jerusalem and be able to go into the temple. He had Timothy circumcised so that he could take him with him around to the churches that he was preaching, although he chose not to do that with Titus because the situation was different and he did not want to make it look like, in Timothy's case, it was to make it easier to go do what he was doing, which is exactly what we're talking about here, although in that case it was more Timothy that bore the burden of that. But Titus, it was a different situation. The Jews were pressuring him to do it, and he's saying, or the Judaizing Christians actually were pressuring him to do it, and he said, I'm not going to do it. So when he would go to evangelize, he would do what was appropriate for that situation as long as it was within God's law. He says, to the weak I became like the weak. He's talking about Christians or people who were weak, who didn't believe you could do certain kinds of things that Paul knew you could do. He's going to say, okay, I'm not going to do those things, and I'm not going to talk about those things and get them all freaked out about those things. He goes along and he talks about without the law and so on and so forth. And so the goal is not to meet them where they are and then leave them there. And that is a really important point to understand. The goal is to meet them where they are, teach them about the gospel, and start them on the progress of growing up in the gospel. So that the next time he goes back and talks to them, they are not under the law anymore. They are not the weak anymore. They are not without the law or of Christ anymore. And so he's not leaving them there. He's not saying, I'm going to go to the weak and I'm going to tell them everything's okay. And I'm going to go to the Jews and I'm going to tell them everything's okay. He's saying, I'm going to go there and I'm going to tell them the gospel, and that's going to raise them up out of whatever it is that flawed understanding or that insufficient faith that they have to get them where they need to be. But in the process, the trick is don't get stuck in it yourself. And I want to go back to Steve because I didn't know if you wanted to talk some more about that, because I think it's a really important observation. So you don't want to talk much more anyway. Okay, so when we talk about not getting caught up in these things, this is where it takes a certain strength of character coupled with an understanding of the word to know that just because God said go talk to the world, that doesn't mean we're supposed to go be like the world. And that's where I think we have to be very cautious because, even especially as we're looking at something like this where we're talking about pop culture and we're talking about ways we can use pop culture to kind of bring up the topics of Christianity, we also have to be careful because the more we immerse ourselves in pop culture, the less we become, the more desensitized we become to all of the problems with pop culture. And it's kind of interesting to me because as I've done this class, and I've done classes like this in the past and used movies to talk to teenagers about things, one of the things that's always striking to me is that I'll go back and rewatch something and I'll suddenly notice, because now I'm thinking in terms of, I'm going to be showing this at church, and suddenly things start jumping out at you that you didn't notice the first time. Oh, there was a bad word in there. We probably shouldn't show that part. Or, oh, that was a little bit suggestive. Maybe we shouldn't show that. And you become much more conscious of it because I'm thinking in church terms. I'm thinking in terms of who I'm presenting it to. And that's actually slightly troubling when you think about it, not because of what I'm overlooking, but because I'm not thinking like that all the time. Because that's how we ought to be thinking all the time, is in terms of how does this match up with my faith? What would happen if the people from church were sitting behind me at the movie theater and watching the same movie that I'm watching? Or going into the bar and doing the same things that I'm doing, or seeing me do those things. And in a small town like this, you become much more cognizant of that reality too than I ever did down in the valley, because it's huge, and you live a long way away from most of the people you know, and chances that you're going to encounter one of them by accident in Walmart is pretty low. And when it does happen, it's really shocking and kind of exciting. Here, it's just like, well, there's another one, I mean, 2 or 3 of my students work in Walmart, and I don't go to Walmart anymore without seeing at least one person I know. So we become more cognizant of this in a small town, but as Christians, we may be even more cognizant of the fact that although we do have to walk through the world, we cannot get ourselves contaminated by it. And we have to be mindful of what the world's influence is doing to us as we are working our way through it. And so Paul says that he became weak, he went to the Jews, he became without the law, all those things to reach out to those people, but he also reminds us, but I'm under the law of Christ. I'm not under the law of Moses. I'm not the weak. You know, he knows those things, but at the end what he says is, the purpose of this is so that I might by all means, or we could use the word any means, save some. So the goal of all of this is to reach out to some, to save some. And this speaks to a really important secondary aspect of this, and I don't think this is something, I'm preaching to the choir here ironically in sort of the reverse sense. The mistake that so many Christians and so many people of faith have made throughout the years is, look, the world's so messed up, the only way that I can make this work is to just retreat from it. So you have the monks and the nuns that go into their monasteries. That was conservatory was the word that came up, and that's not the right word. They're monks and nuns, and you have, you know, the priests who you know, isolate themselves in many ways. You have the Amish, and you have the you know, you can go through and you can look and see a lot of different groups throughout the years that have tried to do this, or individuals that have tried to do this. Go out in the woods by yourself and just live by yourself, communing with God and nature. And the reality is that that's not the concept at all, because that's that whole guarding the faith in the bad way at that point. I've decided I have to detach from the world because the world is contaminating me. I've got to guard my faith, and I've got to get away from everything. Well, that's not the way to go. That's not the solution, because if we do that, then we take away the gospel from the people that need to hear it. And if we do that, we take away the ability to shine light. You can't shine light, you can't be a city on a hill if you are, as Jesus says, hiding under a bushel. Or the picture I have one time of the city on a hill. It's actually a monastery, I believe, in I forget where it's over in Europe somewhere, but it's built on the side. It's built into this gigantic, basically, all four sides are cliffs, and it just sticks up out of the ground. And the monastery is up there. The only way to get up there is actually by this basket that they lower down, they put things in and raise it back up again. That's a city on a hill, but that's a really unhelpful city on a hill because it's unapproachable. You know, so we don't want to be like that. We don't want to be isolated like that. We want to be the ones who are sharing the gospel. Now, with that said, all of us, to a greater or lesser extent, have one or more things that is a particular struggle to us, a particular temptation to us. And maybe it's something that's in the world, maybe it's something that's inside of us, but either way, if we're talking about that particular situation, maybe that's a situation we don't go into. If you know you've got a problem with alcohol, you don't go into the bar to preach to the drunks. It's just not a good idea, you know? So we have to have a little bit of wisdom about that, but that's also why there's a bunch of us, you know? So somebody else can go do that, or we can do it in a group so it's not a problem for just a single individual. So there's ways we manage those kinds of things, but we should be mindful that we can fall into temptation by going if we're not careful about where we're going and what our particular struggles are. So these are all things that we need to take into account and we need to be considering when we are thinking about how we reach out to people.
You know, when we were bringing up the kids, we always started our day with breakfast together, and we usually ended it with dinner, except during baseball season because everybody was going different directions, but there was always a parent with one of the kids. And that opened a lot of conversation, because you say, what did you do today? Pardon me. And usually nothing, so it was just another wasted day, you know, we joke. But as they got older, they would come home with questions and issues about different things, and that opened the door for us to engage them, to bring them up. You know, Steve always has joked that, and it's true, we raised our children to leave home. And to go out and be self-sufficient individuals and Christians in this world. And we have that same benefit of coming here together and worshiping together and growing together and helping one another, having these discussions. Same thing as our dinner table. We have this. And it encourages us and it strengthens us. We're commanded to do it so that we can encourage one
Yeah.
another.
And so that we can, if we have to, number one, leave here and go out and minister to the people around us and spread the gospel. But number two, if we have to go somewhere else, we're not lost because we don't have this particular group anymore. Two things in there that really resonated with me. One is what you said about the discussions with the kid. My mom always talks about that with my brother and I, that we had dinner together almost every night, and we would sit down and we would talk. And it was never, they weren't sitting down and quizzing us. Did your teacher talk about this today? Did your teacher talk? Because you know that if you say something like to a kid, they're going to clam up because that's an interrogation, and anybody who's had an interrogation knows to stop talking. Except criminals, for some reason, they're really stupid about that. But in general, we understand, stop talking. And so it was just conversation, and these things would come out, and they found out a number of things that we were being taught or that we were encountering that were problematic, and they gave them an opportunity then to talk to us about those things and to give us an alternative perspective on that. And doing that is how you get kids ready to go out. The mistake is that a lot of parents, I think, are preparing their kids to not go out. They're teaching their kids, they're trying to limit what they understand, to limit what they know, to shield them from things. And I realize, you don't need to, 5-year-olds don't need to know about what's going on in Israel and Gaza right now, not in detail anyway. But at the same time, smart parents, and not being a parent, I feel entirely qualified to say this, smart parents, in my observation, know how to gradually expand their children's sphere of awareness as they get older, and to help them understand at the levels that they're encountering these new things, so that when they encounter new things that the parents haven't thought about, or when they're out on their own and they're dealing with that kind of stuff, they're not completely freaked out by the fact that things that are bad are happening, or that things that are unexpected are happening. They're prepared to deal with the unexpected and the undesirable, not because they have every answer, but because they know how to think for themselves. Tim?
Along those lines, since Karen brought it up, Terry's going to vouch for this one. When our kids hit about 13 or 14, I used to tell them, start preparing yourself. When you're 18, the locks get changed on the house. Terry goes,
a bit harsh.
Yeah, Terry goes, are you kidding? I said, yeah, but they don't know that.
Hey, they're only 13, they're not that smart yet. So. Georgia?
Well, on the other hand, Buck used to always tell David when he turned 18, he was going to stand at the door with a suitcase. He said, that's okay, Dad, Mom's going to be at the back door, letting me back in.
I like that.
I like that. So when we take that mindset with our earthly families and our earthly children, and we bring it into the church family concept, I think that it says a couple of really important principles, and I realize we're kind of getting away from the spreading the gospel aspect to this, but these are tied together in some very real ways, because spreading the gospel is half or more of the project, but getting people to grow into their spirituality and get to heaven is the other half of it. And that's what the church is for. The church exists for that purpose, and so when we think about our earthly families, we can see, I think, pretty clearly that it's a bad idea to shield our children from everything, to try to hide them away from all the things that could go wrong, and then hope that somehow they're going to be able to figure it out on their own, or hope that somehow they're just going to stay and remain like children in our family forever. That's unnatural. But in the church, a lot of times, we don't want to talk about hard stuff. We don't want to talk about stuff that we might disagree about. We don't want to talk about stuff that's, when somebody's doing something they ought not to be doing. We don't want to talk about that. We'd rather just kind of sweep it under the rug or hope they go away, It's astonishing, and this could get me into trouble later on, I suppose, in a sense, but it's astonishing how many churches terminate relationships with ministers. And I'm using that term because they don't always fire them. Sometimes they ask them to resign. There's a lot of different ways. But the minister goes somewhere else, and the next church almost never hears about why it was that relationship broke down. And that should be disturbing, because something went wrong. Now, maybe it's just, hey, we kind of outgrew his preaching, or maybe it's, different directions or different visions, but it's not usually that. It's usually something more, or it's oftentimes something more fundamental, and somehow that's not getting to the next church. And that says that we don't want to talk about something that we really ought to be talking about at least a little bit, because if it was bad for us, maybe we shouldn't let it be bad for somebody else, There's kind of this code of silence in the church when it comes to a lot of these things. And I'm not saying we need to be, knock down, drag out arguments and yell at each other and things like that. I'm just saying that as grown-ups, we ought to be able to talk about grown-up things and address those things in a grown-up and civilized and loving way without all freaking out. Now, somebody over there raised their hand. Steve,
Well,
I'm
I was
sure.
just gonna say, that there is a balance between what Paul is trying to portray and subjecting yourself to things that may tempt you. And so the Bible tells us to be cautious both ways. Don't get involved with bad company, don't get into things under the pretense that you're going to convert someone, but really what it is an excuse to go out and just have the fun you want to have, and it doesn't really work that way. And if we have weaknesses that we know of, we should just choose not to tempt ourselves that way.
Yeah.
And go that direction.
Yeah. Paul says, it's interesting because at different times the scriptures say, resist the devil and he will flee from you. It also says, flee from temptation. And I think that the distinction there is, in a broad sense, we resist the devil by resisting temptation, by avoiding temptation, by doing good, by spreading the gospel. All those things are resisting the devil. But when we encounter temptation, the correct response is not, you know, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Let's see how tempted I can get before I blow it. You know, that's not the way we want to think about it. We want to think in terms of, we got to get away from this, you know, and we got to find smart ways to deal with that. Jerry.
In the past, I've had the responsibility of talking to some of these congregations where the preacher has left. And I have found just what you said, they don't want to talk about it. I have ended up, the question that I ask them when it's all, the conversation is about over, I said, would you hire them again?
That's a good question.
And if the answer, you know, there's usually a pause, and then they would say no.
They start that, or they start equivocating. Well, you know,
Yeah.
all right, thank
But
you.
that was to me was a clue
Yeah.
that there was something that they're not telling us.
And we don't want to be engaging in gossiping. And the scriptural principle when we're dealing with our brothers is we go and talk to them first if we think there's a problem. With a preacher that's been fired, presumably there's been a conversation on what the problem was, and it's been decided that they can't be there anymore. So I use that example only because it highlights our unwillingness to kind of deal with some of the uglier realities sometimes. But I think that as Christians, as a family, we need to recognize that part of our job is to build each other up and help each other grow up, and sometimes that isn't always entirely comfortable. Parents know you have to have some awkward conversations with your kids, whether it's saying, I'm very disappointed in you, or whether it's talking about some things that you just assume not have to talk about with your kids. But in the church, we sometimes have to do that too. We have to have conversations about, you know, we're disappointed in this is what concern to us, and we sometimes also have to say, you know, there's some stuff we need to talk about that we don't necessarily always feel comfortable talking about.
Like not messing with the thermostat.
Okay, you seem to mind talking to us about that. You seem pretty prepared to do that. But I was thinking more in spiritual terms. Thank you. That's a fair point. And sometimes it may be that we need to turn the camera off and have conversation, because that may not always be the best thing to be putting out on the internet. But you know, obviously the goal of the worship is not to have that kind of a conversation. But there are definitely times where as a church, I think we do sometimes have to have those conversations. Steve?
I was just gonna say something funny.
Oh, yes.
Go for it.
Maybe after this morning, we should have a meeting with Jerry.
No, I didn't miss, I was here last week.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Take care of it.
So,
Yeah, it's an
all right,
intervention.
so this,
Probably warranted.
yeah, maybe. Okay, so, any last thoughts on this before we move on? And I'm just going to preview what we're going to be talking about, what the movie we're going to be looking at in bits and pieces for the next several weeks. Any last comments or thoughts to share?
Well, I think it's important when we're out in the world working, raising our children. Our children have friends and parents meet. We gotta be the Christian we are supposed to be, who we want to be. We cannot acquiesce on little things, because those little things add up and they become bigger. And that's an example to your children. That, oh, well, mom and dad said that'd be okay because those people were doing. Well, no, just because they're doing it doesn't mean I'm going to partake. And so we have to stand up for who we are and who we want Christ to see us
Yeah.
as, because then the rest of the world will see us that way too.
Yeah, I agree. All right, anybody else, any last thoughts? All right, so I'm not even gonna show you a video, I'm just gonna tell you that what we're gonna be looking at actually is a movie that I really enjoy. I don't know how many of you have seen this movie, it's called Catch Me If You Can. It's Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. The story of a guy by the name of Frank Abagnale, who is one of the more prolific con men and check, what do you call it, the check kiters in history. He eventually was caught and ended up working with the FBI, catching other people who did that kind of stuff. It's a really interesting movie. If you haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend that you try to watch it at some point, because it's a great movie. It's a lot of fun. And it's got some, there are a few scenes in it that are a little questionable, so I don't recommend it sort of wholeheartedly. I wouldn't watch it with little kids or something like that. But in general, it's a good movie. We're going to watch some scenes out of it, and as we go along, hopefully you can kind of see why we're going to watch some scenes out of it. I'm not going to tell you yet, so we'll kind of go from there. So we're going to get done a little early today, but I don't want to go over because that seems to be my trend. So we'll stop here, and next week we'll pick up with Catch Me If You Can. So thank you guys for your participation. It's been a lot of fun.